Okay, we're going to talk about Walter Kempner Revisited with a patient's point of view commentary from the book Fat Like Us by Jean Renfro Anspaugh. So for starters, this is a picture of the morning weigh-ins at the Rice House in Durham, North Carolina, where Walter Kempner ran the Rice Diet program. And it created a culture of peer pressure and friendships that was very helpful to the patients. They would have to publicly weigh in the rice houses where the rice was fed in the morning for breakfast with the other patients. So everyone saw each other and could tell if they were losing weight, following the diet, making progress. They had something called the Century Club. I wrote Centurion Club on there. It's really Century Club. For persons who had lost over 100 pounds, they would get their picture on the wall. And again, it was very high status to be a successful dieter amongst all the other rice persons there. They used to call themselves the Ricers. They would write their blood pressures publicly, so everyone could see how you were doing. So there was strong incentive to stick with the program and follow the diet. Then they would serve just rice and fruit was how the diet initially began. After a month or so, if the person was doing well and their labs were good, they would start to add in some vegetables and eventually even some potatoes and sweet potatoes. Walter Kempner was an incredible doctor. I've now had more time. I've read through. Here's the biography. If you want to read a biography of him, it's called Walter Kempner and the Rice Diet, Challenging Conventional Wisdom. The author's name is Barbara Newborg, and she's a physician who worked with him for many, many years. So she knows everything about the program. She was with all the patients and making rounds every day with Dr. Kempner. It's a real good book. Little gossipy, you know, it's written by a woman. She's talking about all the friendships and all that stuff, and way more detail on that than I would have expected. But she also went through all the medical stuff, and I'll just show you a quick picture here of the kind of stuff you'll see with Kempner. It's rather unique, a Kempner book. You'll see all these x-rays. I don't know how well I can show it here. I'll have some pictures of it. All these chest x-rays reverted to normal. All these pictures of retinal photographs where the retinas were markedly abnormal initially from hypertensive, diabetic retinopathy and whatnot, and then they reverted to normal. You'll see these patients swollen up from kidney failure and fluid overload, and they returned to normal. It's incredible. Dr. McDougall had said that Walter Kempner is perhaps the greatest doctor who ever lived. That might be true. There's no other doctor like Walter Kempner. You know, I read medical books all the time. My life's pretty boring. I'm always going through one medical book or paper after another. There's no one like Walter Kempner. It's extraordinary, the story. I mean, he's like the rock star of all nutrition doctors, of all doctors. And he took care of very sick patients. Durham, North Carolina became a referral center for all these patients with severe hypertension, systolic blood pressures over 200. And he basically ran what we would nowadays call like the equivalent of a nutrition intensive care unit. There were no antihypertensive pills in those days. There was no dialysis in those days. The Rice Diet began in 1939. Kempner's so-called medications were rice and fruit initially. He was born in 1903. Went to medical school in Germany where he was born. He then fled Germany in the 1930s, came to Duke University. He initially was a kidney researcher. He had done research for 3 years or so with Otto Warburg, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in 1931, who figured out that hypoxia of 35% or more induces cancer. Okay, so that same lab, there were 2 additional Nobel Prize winners, Hans Krebs, Theodore Burrow. And there's another one, Ebden-Meyerhoff, from the Ebden-Meyerhoff pathway. Okay, so, Meyerhoff. Okay, anyways, it's extraordinary stuff. This really is. And Warburg, they all came out of the same laboratory. That's the most productive biochemistry laboratory ever. What are some other extraordinary things about him? He was most proud of the patients having all these retinal photographs revert to normal. No one believed that that was possible until he had done it. Patients with papilledema and retinopathy. People had seen papilledema revert, but never seen these retinopathies with hemorrhages and hard exudates revert to normal. What else about him? Well, he noticed that, you know, from studying the kidney and all his research with tissue cultures and what, he noticed that kidney cells, their main job, about 75% of the energy goes to excreting nitrogen. Nitrogen only comes from protein. There's no protein in carbohydrates or fats. So if you want to make life easier for the kidney, you can decrease protein intake. And rice, for example, has only 5% protein, plus there's even significantly less in fruits. So the point of all this was, if you metabolically have a cell with high demand and low energy supply from hypoxia due to obesity, due to a high-fat diet, due to a high-sodium diet, kidney cells can die. They can go into programmed cell death called apoptosis. So when you lower the workload, you protect them from being overloaded in terms of their workload relative to their energy supply. And so he figured this all out way back in those days in the 1930s, and he had lots of patients in kidney failure, and he kept them alive. They would have just died. There was no dialysis back in those days. He also recognized that sodium, it's a vasoconstrictor, and he also had noticed that it'll have an effect to decrease insulin sensitivity, so he really wanted to lower his dietary sodium. And so he made his diet very low in protein to protect the kidney, very low in sodium also to protect the kidney and to decrease the incidence of diabetes. He also made it very low in fat. The papers were already coming out by that time. Like J. Shirley Sweeney wrote his papers in 1927 about diabetes being primarily due to high dietary fat. Himsworth paper from England, those came out in the 1930s as well. About dietary fat causing diabetes, increased insulin resistance. And Rabinowitz's papers came out about that time as well. He's a guy from Canada. Okay, so the Kempner diet, what's the point of it? It's primarily initially rice, fruit juice, and fruit. It's the ultimate low sodium, low protein, low fat diet, but it's very high in carbohydrate. The exact percentages are, it often gets written as a 90-5-5 diet, meaning 90% carbohydrate, 5% protein, 5% fat. Actually, according to Dr. Newberg, and she goes through it right in this book here, it is actually, she said, 93% carbohydrate, 4% protein, and 3% fat. So those are incredible numbers. And remember, some patients were on this diet for years. And people have talked about that before. Dr. McDougall had a very nice lecture on protein. He talks about milk being 5% protein. I've read elsewhere it's 6% protein, but either way, it's pretty low. And that's the most rapidly growing phase of a person's life. So it makes sense. They've done studies, how do you feed poor people as cheap as possible and keep them healthy? So you can feed somebody just 4% protein, even a little less than that, and they're fine for a prolonged amount of time. And also 3% fat. They're fine for a prolonged amount of time. And then we've also talked about it previously in the lectures about Pritikin, the Winnett study and the McKean studies, whereby they were feeding people 0.7% fat, 0.7% fat for prolonged amounts of time. And those were just omega-6 precursor fats, and the patient, like linolenic acid. And the patients did very well. Okay, so that's rather interesting. And they also noticed, Kempner was aware that decreased oxygen to tissues, which can be caused by obesity, like a Pickwick syndrome effect, whereby the big fat belly makes it more difficult for the diaphragm to lower. High-fat diet, that wasn't as clearly understood in his day, but he was big on recognizing that tissue hypoxia is a major cause of illness. And of course, he knew from Warburg that tissue hypoxia is a major cause of cancer. And they noted that the average PO2 significantly improved in the patients with large amounts of weight loss. In addition, Newberg was aware that many of the patients with arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and psoriasis dramatically improved or even reverted to almost normal in some situations. So that can tie into, there's multiple reasons why that can happen. Inflammation, but also hypoxia. But this idea of reversal of an autoimmune disease, they were aware of that many, many years ago. That's extraordinary. So Kempner did give his patients a multivitamin. Every day at those morning weigh-ins, he also checked their blood pressure. He followed their blood electrolytes and their urine electrolytes very closely. He felt that the rice diet, especially the initial strict form of it, the patients had to be monitored very closely, especially if they were kidney failure patients, because it took a while to figure out how well their kidneys were functioning and what specifically their kidneys might have a problem with. You got to be careful with potassium in somebody with severe kidney failure. But eventually, if the patient was doing quite well and had reasonably good kidney function, he let them eat vegetables, potatoes, and sweet potatoes. So here's just a picture of a normal retina. He was starting out with a diabetic hypertensive retinopathy in particular, and there's all these little hemorrhages. There's these little hard exudates and whatnot, cotton wool spots. Their eyes a mess, and these patients are losing their vision. And many of them, I saw one paper where he had like 119 patients and 7 partially reversed, like 4 didn't reverse, and then the rest of them all came back virtually almost to normal. So those are incredible results. And he kept, retinal photographs, blood pressure recordings, like at least 1 chest x-ray, EKG on all these patients. So it's quite extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it in all my reading of medical literature. He also had incredible results in many of these patients. Their heart would shrink down to a normal size. He would check a chest x-ray on them. So these are 2 drawings of chest x-rays. And initially there's a heart measurement, and then there's a comparative heart measurement on the follow-up. So normally the heart should be less than 50% of the side-to-side diameter of the chest. In order to standardize the measurements, he would look at the overall length of the chest. And they try to photograph them, take the chest x-rays in a standard way, so one would have reliable measurements for comparison. So this is the left cardiac border, this is the right cardiac border, and you just measure the heart from one side to the other side here. And here's an example of a heart that shrank from 17.5 centimeters to 14 centimeters. And by the way, this is all coming from the scientific publications of Dr. Kempner and from the book of Dr. Newborg, which summarizes scientific publications. So this is just one patient who in only about 8 months, the guy lost almost 200 pounds, 180 pounds. His blood glucose came down from the diabetic 248 down to 91. His proteinuria, the kidneys losing protein, which is a bad thing, it's a bad sign, it's an ominous finding of future problems to come, reverted to normal. His blood pressure went from 200 over 130 down to 130 over 86. And by the way, this is just like one sample average patient. There were hundreds and hundreds of patients like this. So he had some patients essentially almost like in a cardiac failure picture, dramatically improving. And other patients with simply a Pickwick syndrome, which just means obesity-related hypoventilation, because the big fat belly makes it harder for this diaphragm to lower, so they can't oxygenate their blood as well. Okay, some more about Kempner. And, Kempner did a lot of nice things. When patients didn't have money, he would let them just come anyways. Maybe pay a little for the food, but they didn't have to pay him for any of his fees. He was happy to take care of people and help people out. He routinely would have as many as 150, 250 patients in Durham. One time he had 330 active patients. That's how busy he was. I mean, he basically did so much to help Durham, North Carolina, and Duke Medical Center. It's incredible. He made the hospital world famous. The patients would just live in hotels, apartments, rooming houses, trailer parks, anywhere they could get a place to stay. For them, it was almost like a religious pilgrimage. They were dying of obesity socially or in terms of their health, and this was their chance to save themselves. These patients, typically like the fat ones that went there, they tried everything else. They failed all the other diets, and they saw Durham as their last chance. And then, that culture of going to the daily weigh-ins in front of everyone else. They got to know the other Rice House persons. They'd eat their meals together. All their meals at the Rice House, just rice and fruit. Kind of boring. So they would talk to each other, get to know each other, and be friends. And basically, if you were a successful dieter, you became high status in that group. And Kempner would walk up to the patient and ask them, "Did you lose? Did you lose?" The guy was actually genius. He was brilliant, but he had a little bit of an accent that sort of actually made him this more imposing figure. He's also pretty tall. I actually think somebody ought to make a movie about Kempner. And the Rice diet. It's such an incredible story. 2 other guys ran the Rice diet for a while. Dr. Rosati with his wife who was a nurse, and then Frank Nealon, another physician. They ran the Rice diet for a while after Kempner, but it gradually sort of faded out for multiple reasons. There's now pharmacology available for treatment of hypertension as well. And for other reasons, whatever, it sort of gradually got phased out. But that'd be a fun thing to do. That'd be a fun job. I think it would be. With urine electrolytes, Kempner could tell if somebody cheated on the diet. Basically, because his diet was so restrictive of sodium, if a patient started eating other types of food, there'd be more sodium in the diet. Because it was restrictive of protein, if they started eating other things, cheating on the diet, there'd be high nitrogen in there. And usually when people eat sodium, they're eating sodium chloride, so chloride would go up in the urine as well. So he knew And Kempner was kind of an old-fashioned strict guy. If he found somebody was cheating on the diet, they'd get a warning. They'd maybe be kicked out of the program. He even sometimes would take their credit card. He would take their car keys so they wouldn't be able to cheat on the diet. He kind of knew some of them on a personal basis and did some things that we would consider not so normal nowadays. When patients strayed from the diet, some patients he had a riding crop, he would whip them across their buttocks. I mean, Kempner was kind of a wild, dominating guy. But like I said, he might be the greatest physician who ever lived. Besides all this crazy stuff, it was amazing. To read through his scientific publications, you just see patient after patient that any doctor would say, this guy's dead, this guy's dead, this guy's dead, and then Kempner would save them. It was incredible. Okay, not all of his patients lived. I mean, he had patients where everybody predicted them to be dead in a year or two, and he would save about 2 out of 3 in that category. Okay. Kempner became very rich. He was also tall. He was a very handsome man. He never married, and he kind of had like a harem of girlfriends. And he did nice things for them. He would pay for their college education. He would buy houses for them. And then he had all the houses connected to the walkway. One patient claimed that he had whipped her for not following the diet, etc., etc. And here I'll show you a picture of an artist's rendering of Kempner's lifestyle here. So this was Kempner's house, and he had a walkway to his girlfriend's houses. So this is babe number 1, babe number 2, and here's the famous babe number 3. Okay, so now we're going to talk about another aspect of the rice diet in the Kempner program. One viewer of my lecture told me about this book. It's called Fat Like Us. So Fat Like Us is the book, and here's the author's name, Jean Renfro Anspaugh, Fat Like Us. And she's a lady who was fat, and she went, here's a picture of it, I don't know if you can see the picture. She went to the rice diet program at Durham. She actually met Dr. Kempner. And this book is very funny. This lady, she got like a master's degree in folklore and stuff, and she's very nice, she's clever, she's funny. This book is like the Canterbury Tales of dieting. So people would see it as almost like a religious pilgrimage to go out to Durham with the great Dr. Kempner like a prophet. And the other thing she said is like he was like the Wizard of Oz and this was going to Emerald City, the land of dreams and the promised land over somewhere. Okay, so anyways, she talked about the psychology of being a fat person. I was fat for a couple years myself, so I kind of have a sense of it. Basically, you reach a point where you're almost about to give up and think it's your destiny to be fat. I would not accept that, but a lot of people do. Because most of the fat people I know, they've been fat for 20-something years and they're sort of hopeless. And they don't believe they can change. So you talk to them and they're like, you know. She tried all of the other diets and failed. And she had a lot of funny vocabulary in this book about Durham being the promised land. The patient goes there to be redeemed and pay for their sins. That people feel a call to take a pilgrimage to Durham. And then a lot of these patients, though, I think don't really have a good nutritional understanding because they would still talk about a cheat day, and then they would all talk about their last supper, the last meal they had before they went to Durham, and how they would eat all this junk food and stuff, which sounds incredibly stupid to me because you don't achieve your health goals by playing games and having cheat days and stuff like that. You do it by learning about nutrition and eating healthy. And there was lots of funny vocabulary. For example, where they had this Hilton hotel would have a dance party for the ricers periodically, and that was called the Crisco Disco. A fat woman, if she could find a man who liked fat women, he was called a chubby chaser. At the pool where all the ricers would go, that was called the whale watch. And this book, Fat Like Us, like I said, it's very entertaining. It's full of jokes and stories like that. What she did, the reason I say it's like the Canterbury Tales, is she just interviewed all these people at the Rice House, and the ones who had the best stories, she included them in her book. That was sort of, she used that like to graduate from her master's degree program, which she went back and did after she was older. So she had a more mature, sophisticated point of view on life. She talked about a fat person being like a caterpillar wanting to emerge from the cocoon of Durham, North Carolina as a butterfly, and what a big deal it was how people treated you so differently from being fat versus when they were thin. She said it's incredible how much better she was treated when she was skinny compared to when she was fat, and all the other fat women kind of agreed with that. So the book was very entertaining, clever, and funny. I liked all that about it, but I did see a big weakness in the book. You know, here's this lady who's been through all this problem, all the different diets she's been on. She really didn't have a sense of developing understanding of nutrition. It was sort of like she wanted Dr. Kempner to save her, and he was able to save her. I mean, she lost a lot of weight, but a big problem with a lot of these rice dieters is many of them, as soon as they would leave Durham, go back to their own families and homes, get back to their old environment, they would get fat again. That was actually very, very common amongst them. And so I saw that as a big weakness of the whole rice diet program, is they didn't spend enough time teaching the patients. Even Newborg's book, great book, but there wasn't that much emphasis on educating the patients about why the rice diet was good. What are the benefits of eating starch, for example? Kempner saw a lot of these patients as an emergency, and he just sort of felt like, you don't need to talk, just do it. Follow the diet. We know it works. Okay? And you know, for the people to be successful when they went out on their own, they need to have some understanding of why they're choosing one thing and avoiding another thing. Also, Kempner, initially at least, he would lower the number of calories, especially for the fat persons. So there was a mild starvation component. Don't get me wrong, the rice diet was much different than starvation, and once they get past the initial phase, they would be in a nitrogen balance, meaning that they're taking in as much protein as they're excreting. So they were no longer in a starvation phase. Their labs were actually quite different than those of a starvation patient. Probably the best weight loss book, if you're interested in losing weight or you got a fat friend or relative to give a book to, is probably this one called Secrets of Ultimate Weight Loss by Chef AJ. And she's a lady who's, you know, she's real smart. She was fat herself for a while. She lost all the weight. She's coached lots of patients to lose weight. She's thoroughly educated on all the, sort of a lot of it of a Dr. McDougall perspective on weight loss. He's probably the best nutrition doctor in the world. He's very similar to Esselstyn, probably a little bit more lenient than Esselstyn. And there's sort of a social support thing that goes with the website, because that's one thing I noticed about Durham. That social environment of everyone's there to lose weight, it's normal to be fat, and it's normal to be a dieter, and there's lots of places to walk around and exercise. It created a wonderful environment for losing weight. There ought to be more of these places. I would love to work at one. You know, you got a place where everyone walked, the big high hill, they called it Cardiac Hill. It was a great thing. Okay, well, this is just one picture showing why, you know, potatoes and white rice are incredible weight loss foods, because they're so low in fat. The higher the percent of fat in the diet, the more a person gains weight. The lower the percent of fat, the easier it is to lose weight. So potatoes and rice, just like about 1% fat. Incredibly low amounts of fat. Sweet potatoes will have a little more. They're also very low in protein. So these are incredibly good foods for weight loss and for protecting the kidneys. Meats are terrible. I mean, look at salmon, just for example. There's no way you're going to do well on salmon. 50% fat and 50% protein. So both of those things are going to make it hard for you to maintain kidney function long term and to lose weight on stuff like that. Here's just a picture of the amount of omega-3s and omega-6. So omega-6 in the blue, omega-3s in the red. And basically, there's a lot of that stuff. People say, oh, well, if you minimize your fat intake, you're going to be fat deficient. No, no, no. Well, Nathan Pritikin had said, too, there's no such thing as any naturally occurring diet that's deficient in fats. There's a lot of omega-6 and omega-3s in the stuff. You'll be perfectly fine. It's a good goal to minimize dietary fat and dietary protein. You'll be surprised when you read about it more how useful that is. Kempner did not allow nuts, dates, avocados, olive oil, or dried fruits or canned fruits. He didn't allow anything that would add sodium. So he was pretty strict in what he felt. And Kempner said, you know, you make a small change in this diet, you could ruin the whole therapeutic effect. He very specifically picked rice. It had, you know, all the essential amino acids. The body used it very efficiently. It helped him with such a low percent protein intake to get nitrogen balance in these patients. Okay, so here's just a couple references. We talked about Walter Kempner and the Rice Diet, the book by Barbara Newborg. Like I said, she's a physician who worked with him all these years, and so she knows exactly what was going on with the rice diet. It's an excellent book. Scientific publications of Walter Kempner, Volume 2. Volume 1 and Volume 2 are available at the drmcdougall.com spot. I read through all of Volume 2. Volume 1, a lot of it's in a foreign language. I still read what I could of it. A lot of it's in English as well. But Volume 2 is quite extraordinary. You'll see all the EKGs with the inverted T waves, ischemic T waves coming back to normal. You'll see all the reverted photographs of the retinopathies, the chest x-rays improved, the following of the blood pressure. He didn't get that much lowering of cholesterol, which I was a little surprised by. I wonder if he would give the patients sucrose, just table sugar, if he felt they needed more calories. And I wonder if the fructose elevating triglycerides led to a component of hyperlipidemia in these patients. Plus, depends when you measure the lipids. Initially, in a partial starvation phase, it wasn't the same as starvation, but there was a component of that, especially initially, that'll cause elevation of lipids. Lipolysis, as they're losing weight, the fat's being released into the blood. What else of these are a little bit interesting? The Winnett study here from 1970 with chemically defined diets with only 0.7% fat. I referred to that. And the McKean study on chemically defined diets. The same one as the Winnett study, but the point was, so here's the McKean study and the Winnett study. The point was, person is doing very well, prolonged amounts of time on 0.7% dietary fat, and it was primarily just omega-6 fat. This is referring to Kempner's study where he had massively obese patients, a whole bunch of patients that lost over 100 pounds. He pretty quickly could find 106 patients that lost over 100 pounds. That's typical of how incredible the results were of Kempner. Things like, oh, you need a patient that lost over 100 pounds? Do you have one? No, I've got 106 real fast. Here they are, okay? He treated over 18,000 patients. Lots of patients out there. Okay, so hope that was helpful.